Development Bank, the World Bank, and the Stockholm Policy Research Institute. He is teaching peace building at George Washington University and Boston University during this summer. He has previously taught at Boston University, also at PIIA University. And you must all be very familiar with his writing in Dawn. He writes regularly for Dawn. He is the author of many books. In fact, one of his books was launched yesterday at the IBM. We have had a rather rocky relationship, Dr. Moeed W. And I will explain why. Because many weeks ago, Munis is not here. Dr. Munis Ahmad had suggested that he launch his book at this institute, and we had agreed. But I found out by default that the day we were supposed to launch that book, that is today, he was already launching it at the IBM, which I thought was rather irregular. So I opted out of the launch here because there could not be two launches on 2 consecutive days of the same book. However, we didn't want to let go of his expertise and his professionalism and his academic excellence. So we invited him today to speak on the current state of US-Pakistan relations. And I welcome you again, Moeed. Please take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hassan, and to the Institute for this opportunity. I won't further expand on that confusion, but I nonetheless actually am grateful that we are speaking to a very, very important relationship, which you mentioned ours is probably rockier by a factor of 100 on the best day of the relationship. I'm somebody who sits in Washington and sort of watches this from the relationship from that perch. At the same time, I'm somebody who interacts with people here regularly, have conversations with policymakers. So I get a sense of where things are from both sides. And with that in mind, I'll very briefly lay out what I think this relationship looks like today and where it may go in the future. And I hope we can have a conversation around this. The very first thing I'll say is the relationship is broken. I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat this. And broken not because there aren't conversations. There are still regular conversations. Officials are talking, whether remotely or in person. But because I think both sides have gotten to a point where mistrust has taken over virtually every single attempt to fix the problem. Now, a lot of people will talk about this relationship and say that the mistrust is deep because either one side is not truthful, is not sincere, the other one says you're not a responsible or dependable partner. I mean, we talk in Pakistan often about the 1990 scenario of the US disappearing after the Afghan war, etc. But there's a feel to this relationship which says that you promised to be a friend and you broke the promise. And when you talk to people on both sides, you find that there is very genuine, deep-rooted angst on both sides about what they feel the other may have done to them. And when I have sort of unpacked this and talked about it on both sides, I've realized that actually the problem is not about mistrust. The mistrust is a function of the very basic principles of international relations. That is that US-Pakistan interests do not converge in Afghanistan. And fundamentally, this conversation between Washington and Islamabad has been about Afghanistan for the past year. There's really no bilateral conversation that is taking place between the two sides. There's no real conversation on the economy and education and everything else. Some of you who follow this will remember back in 2010 onwards we had something called the strategic dialogue, which is essentially different working groups working on energy, working on education, like a bilateral relationship is. For the past year, it's really Afghanistan. And it's Afghanistan because the US has essentially taken a position which says that unless Pakistan cooperates in Afghanistan, the bilateral relationship will not move. Pakistan's argument, on the other hand, is that bilateral relationship is crucial, even if forward movement on Afghanistan is not possible. And that's essentially where we're stuck. Now, I say that there's a divergence of interest on Afghanistan, so I need to explain why. Because both sides have continued to say over and over that ultimately both want peace in Afghanistan. That's true. Both want peace in Afghanistan, but to operationalize that peace is where the problem lies. From the US perspective, there's been a 17-year investment in Afghanistan. It was initially to defeat Al-Qaeda, and then for nation-building purposes. The Taliban insurgency is showing no signs of losing on the battlefield. They're not winning, they're not going to take over Kabul, but they're not losing either. And in Washington, there is a consensus, and I use this word advisedly, and we can have a conversation, and I'm not saying right or wrong. There is a consensus that the Taliban factions that operate out of or find sanctuary, whatever you want to call it, in Pakistan are a big part of the problem that we're seeing in Afghanistan. And if Pakistan were to do more, the mantra do more, to curb their movement, operations, and force them to negotiate, violence levels in Afghanistan would go down. The Pakistani perspective on this is, of course, that Pakistan supported the US against Al-Qaeda, no other country did more, and that now there is nobody here. And what Pakistan had to do is done. I think there is a middle argument that is missing here. From the US side, that ultimately it is unclear what quantum of violence would be affected if Pakistan were to do what the US is demanding. And how would the presumed backlash that takes place within Pakistan if these groups were to turn inward, how would that affect Pakistan and how would Pakistan come out of that? So I think Pakistan's position essentially is driven by, one, the fear of backlash, and second, quite frankly, the fear that ultimately the Indian presence in Afghanistan, again, right or wrong, the perceived Indian influence in Afghanistan will be perpetuated if the current status quo in Afghanistan holds, or if Afghanistan essentially settles in a way where Pakistan's equities are not taken care of. From the US and to the Afghan government perspective, Pakistan's demands are, they're not irrational, but certainly ones that infringe on Afghanistan's sovereignty as the National Unity Government there sees them. And the ask of Pakistan is essentially to put the Taliban on the table or to go after them in more forceful ways to neutralize that Taliban element from Afghanistan. Here, there is a real divergence because Pakistan feels that whatever it may do, it won't be able to resolve the Afghanistan problem, and if the Afghanistan problem does not resolve, why would it want the Taliban Haqqani network to turn against them and perhaps create backlash? Again, I'm not debating the right or wrong of this, but that's the position. On the US side, of course, the argument is if these people are coming across and killing either American soldiers or Afghans or whatever, it doesn't matter what Pakistan's position is, they need to be neutralized. And we're stuck here, we will be stuck here. And the way I put it is that both sides have spent a lot of time trying to convince the other that the other one's policy is irrational. It's not based on self-interest, and that policy needs to change. In fact, I think both sides are brutally rational in how they're approaching this. And that rationality is leading us on a collision course. And that's the collision that I argue is the definition of a broken relationship. Pakistan, I don't think, is able to do what the US is asking, or will do what the US is asking, or even to deliver the Taliban to the table beyond a point. The US, after 17 years, cannot look the other way and let the insurgency fester, let sort of minority and women rights issues and etc. Be trampled, which the Taliban essentially have a track record of doing. And so here is the juggernaut. The other problem in Afghanistan is that there is any number of Afghan elite who really have no real interest in a peace process. Because the status quo means they have power. Once there's a peace process, they have to share that power. And share that power with a group that is a sworn enemy in some ways and has a very bad track record of ruling Afghanistan in the 90s. How do you move away from this and forward? I think the only possible space where the two sides, Pakistan and the US, converge is this increasing conversation about a political settlement in Afghanistan, which means that the Taliban would be brought to the table and brought into the Afghan system under some arrangement. That arrangement is unknown, but where the US and Pakistan can work together is to figure a way out jointly with the Afghan government, of course, on what the vision for this political settlement is, what the US would do in that. And one of the biggest barriers to political settlement was the Taliban demand that they will only talk to the US and not to the Afghan government. That's finally been broken because both the Taliban and the US have acknowledged publicly that they are having direct conversations. So if that barrier is broken, I see Pakistan's role as essentially cajoling / forcing, come to the negotiating table and essentially negotiate with the US and the Afghan government under whatever formula. But beyond that, I don't think Pakistan can actually force them to deliver on an agreement. So facilitation of the meetings, I think, is the role that Pakistan will have to take up and could take up while a political settlement moves forward. If the political settlement does not move forward, if there's no vision for a political settlement, if there's no process for a political settlement, then I'm afraid the US and Pakistan will keep talking past each other on how to move ahead. And if the argument is that the bilateral relationship will only follow a breakthrough on Afghanistan, then you've got a stalled bilateral relationship, which essentially does not exist for the most part, because, as I said, the only conversation is Afghanistan. Let me also say two other things, and then I'll stop and we can have a conversation. Ultimately, I have looked at this every single way possible, but cannot find a mechanism in which Afghanistan becomes peaceful without the US and Pakistan being on the same side of the divide. There's no possibility of Pakistan trying to find a solution without the US or Pakistan getting isolated in the conversation. So this insecurity on both sides that they need to hold the cards, otherwise things won't move in the direction that they want, I think is a bit made up. Because at the end of the day, both will have to use each other to find a way forward in which ultimately the Afghan government and the Afghan people have to decide where that peace process goes. But to start the peace process, I do think there is a window of opportunity where Pakistan and the US can work together to push this forward rather than the conversation about kinetic operations, etc., which I don't see happening, quite frankly, on the Pakistani side. The final thing I'll say is that this convergence that I talk about, or this opportunity, is going to last between now and the Afghan presidential elections in April. This window will close after that. Because by the looks of it, as things are going, the October parliamentary elections in Afghanistan, I'm still not sure they will take place, but even if they do, signs are not looking too good in terms of their preparation, in terms of the ownership of those elections and what may come out of them. And then you've got a presidential election in April where President Ghani seems to be losing some of his own team who are now joining hands with the opposition to contest the election. There's a bit of ethnicization of politics in Afghanistan again. So it is unclear whether you could have a timely, smooth political process in which you seamlessly transfer either to a new government or the same government continues. And if there's even a small hint of a political crisis, as a rational insurgent, my projection would be, or prediction would be, that the Taliban would actually use that opportunity to create more chaos and more violence to signal that the state is discredited and thus there's nobody to talk. And I think you would find that after this winter season is over, things may get worse, not better. So if I were making decisions on behalf of the US or Pakistan, I would argue that there is a 6-month window, no more, in which absolute urgency should be shown by both sides and the Afghan government to come together to figure a way out on how they're going to work on a peace process that ultimately involves the Taliban and brings them back into the political system. Now, the argument that they should contest the next elections, I think, is unrealistic, but you would have to find some alternative mechanisms in which they're brought in and then gradually mainstream. Because what the Taliban are longing is political legitimacy. And that ultimately is where I think this will have to end. Final point, I do not think there is as big a wedge or disconnect between positions of the Taliban and the Afghan government on what an ultimate peace process may look like. I don't think there is a huge disagreement on the constitution. If you look at the Afghan constitution, I think the Taliban essentially will accept it as long as there's a label that this is not the old one, it's a new one. I think there is not going to be too much of a disagreement on the potential presence, residual presence of US troops in Afghanistan, as long as it's defined for counterterrorism and conditions based and all of that. I think those things are negotiable. The fundamental problem really is the process of this political settlement. It's less on the substance. I think once all sides start talking substance, you will find more agreement than not. The problem is who gives in terms of the process. Who puts their hand up first and says, I will start this, I will compromise, I will talk, etc., etc. That's where I think the US and Pakistan can work out a modality to push this forward. But as we stand today, I'll just leave you with this, and this should tell you how broken I think the relationship is. Multiple times you have meetings between two officials, US and Pakistan. And I'm making this up, this is not a real example, but it is actually reflective of reality. You have a meeting, both sides agree on X. They leave the room, you talk to both sides separately, have you agreed to X? The answer is yes, we've agreed to X. And then you ask them, what is X? And they have polar opposite interpretations of what they have agreed to and what they have to deliver. 10 days later, when neither delivers what the other thought they were going to deliver, you have a whole public spat where both are blaming each other for being unfair and walking back from what they agreed and lying and this and that. I know people on both sides for years who will not lie to me without a reason. I am convinced that neither side is deliberately giving this to lie to the other and walk out of the room deceiving and creating mischief. Much of that happens in international relations, but fundamentally it's a breakdown of communication. And this is where I come full circle to that mistrust question. Because of divergence of interest, because of the failure of rationality to get them together and pushing them to a collision course, I think the mistrust has become so deep that you can't have a conversation without being suspicious of the other side. And so, let me stop.
Thank you, Moeed. Who would like to start the conversation?
May I?
Please, Shahid sir.
My name is Shahid Amin. In a key strategic location. So the United States is not, this is not in the national interest of the United States to write off Pakistan. It will continue to have a dialogue with Pakistan. Although which way it will turn, will only time will show. My perception is that under Trump, we must also make a distinction between American policies as they have been and as they are under Trump. He has a certain attitude shown by his tweet or notorious tweet of January 2018. That is not necessarily, I believe, the opinion of all the concerned circles in the United States involved in foreign policy. But of course, he's the president, and they have to go along. I think at this time, the US is stuck in Afghanistan. It has lost the war in Afghanistan in the sense it has failed to achieve the objectives for which the war has been fought. I mean, there is no such thing as a surrender. I was ambassador in the Soviet Union. When they left, they never surrendered. Remember, they never surrendered. But they failed in attaining the objectives for which they had fought. This is exactly what is happening to the United States. I believe Trump wants to get out. This is already the longest war in American history. It has been an unproductive war. It is a costly war. It is a wrong war in the wrong place. So I believe, although some people disagree, they say, no, the United States is going to stay here for the next 50 years, but I don't agree. I think under Trump, the United States wants to extricate itself from Afghanistan, but not as a loser, or not with a total defeat, a humiliating defeat. The issue is how to find a face-saving formula for US exit from Afghanistan. And that is where they need a political solution. And that is where they need Pakistan to somehow bring the Taliban to the negotiating table with a frame of mind that they will accept some kind of compromise. And of course, the Taliban position is, in my view, the following. They are doing very well militarily. But you are quite right, they are not in a position to capture Kabul or to take over the whole of Afghanistan. And even on the assumption they take over the whole of Afghanistan, it will merely be a new chapter in the civil war of Afghanistan, because the non-Pakhtun will keep fighting. So that is no solution. And the Taliban regime will not be recognized by anybody in the world. Maybe this time not even by Pakistan. So the Taliban have to show some realism. And this is where Pakistan needs to work on them. The Taliban do have some kind of a presence in Pakistan, although we officially deny it. So their leadership seems to be somewhere in Pakistan, or at least they are frequently in Pakistan, if they are not permanently in Pakistan. And we have done a lot for the Taliban, if you go take it historically. So I do think we have a degree of influence on the Taliban, and we should use it. Because if we are able to somehow bring the Taliban to the negotiating table, and there is a solution, that will make a breakthrough in Pakistan-US relations. And this is the real issue. There is no other issue really which is dividing Pakistan and the United States. They have almost the same kind of views on both subjects. This is the only stumbling block, and if it can be crossed, then I think the relationship can improve significantly.
Thank you. The things you listed, logistics is a compulsion, nuclear is net negative from the world's perspective. Dialogue with Pakistan, I actually think there is no dialogue right now. It's basically a conversation about Afghanistan. There's no bilateral conversation at all for the past year. So yes, I mean the written off part I accept, but how do you change the current tone and tenor of the relationship and put it on a positive key is a much tougher needle to move. And that I think can only happen if other things start working in the relationship beyond Afghanistan. The one thing I can say to you with a fair amount of confidence, because I sit there in Washington and see this every day, you mentioned the Trump tweet, and I think the way the tweet came out and the sort of approach to diplomacy is definitely not conventional. But I will tell you that I do not find a single sort of policy enclave in Washington that differs on its views on Pakistan. I think there is a 100% negative consensus on Pakistan in Washington. Whether it should be, why, I mean, we can debate that. But I think that tweet, the wording and all aside, very much echoed the conventional wisdom on Pakistan in Washington. Very unfortunate, but that's where it is. And that makes it very difficult to have a conversation apart from whatever is happening. Here too, quite frankly, you would know this much better than me, but I do think it's become very difficult to have a rational conversation on the US-Pakistan relationship. So I think that's real. And the final thing I'll say is, I completely agree with you, that if Pakistan has influence, and whatever influence it has, it should absolutely use it. Because a continued crisis in Afghanistan hurts nobody more than Pakistan. So I mean, it's difficult to say what the influence levels are, etc. But whatever it is, I think it needs to be used. The reason I think it also is not sometimes used is there's no clarity on what a peace process looks like. And that's why I say that if the US, Pakistan, the Afghan government can together agree on the formula for moving forward, not on the end state, but at least how do you move, then I think there will be more security on all sides to play their cards.
Shahid, would you like to respond?
No, that's all.
Themselves into isolation. So my own sense is they would actually want to continue engaging with the international community because they don't want to be seen as militants, they want to be seen as mainstream political actors. So I think there will be much more of a nuance on foreign forces if the political process moves forward. Diversify, what you're really doing is raising the cost for the other side not to work with you, right? Because you have other options now, you're almost compelling the other side to make sure that you're not left out. That's really what is happening here. As I said when I spoke, I don't see any possible mechanism in which Afghanistan can be resolved as a problem without Pakistan and the US being on the same side. It just doesn't add up. I think without the US, many can create problems but not solve. Without Pakistan, things can move to a point but not to the end point. So sooner or later this has to be worked. And as somebody who works on this relationship day in, day out, I'm a fairly depressed human being, quite frankly, because I can see how things can be changed for the positive. But every time you have that conversation, one side thinks it's a Pakistani argument, the other thinks it's an American argument, and that's the breakdown of trust, quite frankly.